my public high school didn't have an econ
Yeah.
class.
In this week's episode of Mixtape, the podcast, I had the pleasure of talking with one of my favorite people, a young econometrician named Peter Hull. Peter is an assistant professor at Brown University who specializes in a range of applied econometrics topics like education and criminal justice. But he's also one of those rare birds whose applied work somehow manages to also advance our understanding of basic methodology like regression and instrumental variables. In our interview today, we discussed his love of instrumental variables and regression, as well as his journey into economics and econometrics as a young boy in Maine interested in the outdoors and mathematics. We also talk about an important new paper of his with Michal Kolesar and Paul Goldsmith-Pinkham about challenges related to interpreting regressions with more than one treatment, and much more. I'm your host, Scott Cunningham, and this is Mixtape, the podcast. Well, this is great to see you, Peter. Thanks for hanging out.
Yeah.
So I wanted to kind of start off with like a little bit of an icebreaker. It's what I enjoy about you is what your demeanor is like on Twitter, how much you enjoy just being fun and funny, and always laugh every time you make a joke. So I was just kind of thinking we could start off with something light. I just want to know, like, where you grew up and what did you like doing as a kid? And then kind of like related to that, if I could take like the modal days of, of your high school years, like your 11th and 12th grade, what kinds of stuff would I've noticed you doing and thinking about back then?
Sure. Well, that's a great open-ended question. Yeah. So let me do my best. So I grew up in Maine. I grew up in kind of a more rural part of Maine on the coast. And a lot of my childhood and sort of early high school times were spent just in nature, in the woods, sort of just hanging out, walking, really enjoying nature. It was a big part of me growing up. The other thing that was a big part of me growing up was math. So I just got very into math at an early age. Was on math team in high school. We never really, crushed the divisions, but we did pretty well given where we were. And so, my parents, who both sort of come from an academic background, very much encouraged me getting really into math and getting really into, studies more generally and academia more generally.
Yeah.
So I guess growing up, you'd find me after school, like prepping for math team meets, playing Magic the Gathering. I was also in band and in theater. I wouldn't say I was especially cool, but I had a lot of hobbies like that, sort of what you might expect given that description. Yeah.
That's great. Wait, so your mom and dad, they have their academics?
Yeah. So on my dad's not an academic, but on my dad's side, my grandfather and great grandfather were both physics professors at Dartmouth, actually.
Oh, wow.
And my mom is a professor of marine science at the University of Maine.
Oh.
So yeah, growing up, it was very, a bunch of nerds in my house, and a lot of encouragement to just like dive very deep in terms of academic topics. Yeah. It was great.
So that love of nature and stuff, that's partly from your mom.
Yeah, definitely. A big reason why my parents moved to Maine was just the marine science out there is amazing.
Wow.
And being right on the water, and lots of exploring tide pools with my mom, and learning about science and nature. It was just like a very rich place to grow up as a kid.
Wow.
When you grow up in Maine, at some point you're like, I got to get out of Maine, because there's not a ton to do, and you're like 16, 17 looking for something beyond Magic the Gathering and math problems. But growing up as a kid, it was amazing.
I bet. I grew up in a small town in Mississippi, and it was like it's like the whole town is your sandbox. You just everything. Wow.
Yeah,
What kind of vacations would y'all go on?
So actually, it's funny when you live in like Massachusetts or something, you always vacation in Maine. Like you always go a little further north to when you live in Maine, we vacationed in Nova Scotia, Canada. So we would go just even further north.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, my parents actually had some land up there from when they were younger and they were sort of developing it when I was a kid. So in the summers, we would go up to Cape Breton Island, Nova Scotia, very much the middle of nowhere in some ways, but beautiful, beautiful place. And yeah, just sort of
That's cool. Oh, what a neat opportunity all that was as a kid.
Yeah.
Well, so then you end up at Wesleyan.
Yep.
And so how did you end up at Wesleyan? How'd you end up with the econ group in the econ department?
So with Wesleyan, when you grow up where I did, I wasn't very sophisticated when it came to picking colleges. Like I feel like nowadays everyone is very sophisticated and they submit 30 applications or something.
Right.
I ended up mostly applying to schools that grabbed my interest, and so I applied to Dartmouth because of my family sort of legacy there, and I applied to Wesleyan because I was a little bit of a hippie growing up. My parents were a bit of a hippie, but I really liked the vibe there. People are very independent and very sort of outside the box thinking and very engaged. And, I visited both of those colleges, and Dartmouth is great, but something about Wesleyan just sort of grabbed me. Yeah. The way I got into econ was actually kind of by accident. So, my public high school didn't have an econ class. We had some AP classes, but definitely not econ AP. I had to take intro econ, like econ 101, my first year at Wesleyan in order to satisfy a prerequisite for a different major that I thought I wanted to take, which was more like political science, less quantitative actually. But I had a Professor Gil Skillman, who's still there at Wesleyan, great guy, just phenomenal teacher. And I was just hooked. The way that he was using sort of mathematical tools to describe complicated social phenomenon and political phenomenon, like it was fascinating. And that was like theory, right? That was like supply and demand and things like that. And then the next year I had to take an econometrics class. And that just from then on out, it was nothing else. It was very hard to get me. Yeah.
Why? What happened in the econometrics class?
So so I, similarly to not taking economics in high school, I also didn't take statistics. So I was very into math, but it was sort of, real analysis stuff like calculus and things like that. I found that very elegant, very beautiful. Statistics was always presented as like less elegant and less sort of like real math or something. So I never really took it. I struggled a ton in the first econometrics class I took. It was the lowest grade I got in college. It just like didn't click to me. But there was something about it that by the end of the class, I sort of started to see the power of the toolkit. And it was really when we started, talking about regression and especially when we started talking about IV, that there was I sort of started to see just like the magic of, using these formulas to make sense of these data and sort of, take actual real world things and draw conclusions about them. It felt very scientific in a way that, calculus was not. Calculus was very abstract. It was very useful for describing phenomenon, but the inference that you could get with stats, I don't know, there's something about that really, really just unlocked a love in my brain. And it's just ever since then.
It's funny. I want to jump ahead to stuff, but I think I'll probably just try to remember it. So what do you remember being first kind of like struck by with just OLS? What was it that kind of hit you at the beginning?
So, I think the mechanics of it were just very nice. So the thing that I love about regression is that it has all this nice geometric interpretation to it. Like I can draw you a picture, of course, with just, bivariate regression, I can just draw you a picture line and residuals and stuff. And so it had this nice graphical component to it. The whole idea of like projection in higher dimensions, like it just had this nice, I think, geometry to it. And then the geometry mapped very well to the sort of goals, right? So like the whole idea of regression is, you're trying to fit a relationship parsimoniously, like you're trying to approximate some complicated relationship in a small number with a small number of parameters. And the logic of how you do that has this, again, kind of nice geometric logic to it. And something like that really grabbed me. It didn't grab me as much as IV grabbed me. IV just like took me by the belt and just dragged me. I mean, it was amazing when I first learned about this idea of instrumental variables. That was also kind of graphical. It's funny, on Twitter and other places, there's all this DAG versus potential outcome debate. It was actually a DAG that first grabbed me with IV. I mean, I think I still teach IV this way too. I like to draw the picture of, the confounded relationship, and then you have this external thing that comes and like shocks that system. That idea that you can have this sort of system that's, feeding on itself, it's endogenous in some way, the classic reverse causality, simultaneity stuff, or like the emitted variables bias stuff. This idea that you have this system and then you hit it with some shock from the outside, and you can use that to sort of trace out different parts of the system.
Yeah.
Again, I think geometrically and sort of like logically very intuitive, but I had never really seen that logic formalized before.
Yeah.
And yeah, that was, I remember that day very, very clearly when I first learned IV.
Were you thinking of causality the moment you saw IV? Because, sometimes I feel like, you can teach econometrics and never say the word causality. So it's not like everybody.
No, yeah. The way I was taught it, I think, was very much like the classical econometric tradition until fairly recently in the scheme of things, which was more like structural equations and less causal effects.
Right.
So I had this, this idea of like, well, you have like a supply equation and demand equation, and they relate. Yeah. And then you see the equilibrium, and then with IV, you can like move one of the curves around and trace out the other.
Yeah.
Again, sort of very geometric and intuitive, but not causal, like not in the language of causal effects.
Yeah.
And it's funny, I actually remember, just to jump around a little bit, in my first year of grad school, in the like econometric sequence, one of the students at some point when we were talking about IV, obviously in a much more technical way, raised his hand and was like, yeah, but how do I know that this is like a causal relationship or something? And I remember all of us just like being like, oh, wow, that's like such a deep question that we'd never really thought about before. So like, even though, we had learned a ton of just the mechanics, I think you're right that it's only honestly like fairly recently that that connection has really been clarified. And obviously I'm a big proponent of that, but yeah.
You think if you could go back to Wesleyan that you probably were seeing it as causal though?
I think, in some ways, yeah. So, I mean, my first foray into research was, I did this senior thesis, which actually eventually turned into a paper. It's not the paper I'm most proud of at this point, given how much I've learned since then, but, where we were trying to look at sort of the relationship between, it was a development paper. I was looking at the relationship between economic growth and civil conflict. And we used an IV strategy that was sort of coming from like international finance. And, I won't get into the details, but I was sort of always thinking about it as this, causal relationship, that there's some shock that happens in the US and it creates this financial transmission to developing countries, and that deteriorates economic conditions. And then we looked at the effect on civil conflict outcomes.
Yeah.
So I think, that kind of IV paper is, in retrospect, much more similar to the kind of IV stuff that I think about now than the IV as it was taught to me in terms of simultaneous equations and structural models.
Right.
So I think there was something there, but I definitely didn't learn about potential outcomes until mostly Harmless came out, which was after this class. And just like with statistics, the first time I encountered potential outcomes in that book, I was deeply confused. And it took a while to really like get the formalization of it.
Yeah. But you read mostly Harmless before MIT? You did your doctorate.
The timing was amazing. So I was in my senior year of undergrad in 2009 to 2010. and mostly Harmless, I think, came out in early 2009, something like that. So the timing was amazing. It came out and one of my professors was just like, hey, this book seems like something you might want to read. And I was like, this looks goofy as heck. I mean, it's like using like Douglas Adams quotes and stuff, and very silly cartoons, and like who's this Josh Angers guy. But I read it, and I got a lot out of it. Not nearly as much as I would get later, because I didn't have the grad training to really understand a lot of the stuff there. But it very much opened my eyes in terms of seeing how the causal concepts could be formalized in this statistical language.
What, when you read that book initially and then you read it later, and then you go through what exactly, what's the second layer that maybe most people don't see the first time?
That's a great question. I mean, that book is it's so dense with insight. It's a very unusual textbook in that it doesn't try and cover like lots of ground, but the ground that it covers in like real depth. And obviously, I mean, the nice thing about Josh as a textbook writer is that and Steve too, is that they're not just econometricians, but they really use things. They really use the tools in applied research. And so I think when you first read the book, at least when I first read the book, I was mostly getting the like applied insights out of it because I didn't have the mathematical sort of training. But then as I read it later in grad school, and eventually I actually took the class that Josh sort of, I don't know if you base the book on or like they co-evolved together, and then I eventually TA'd it. And like, I feel like each of those times I sort of got deeper and deeper in terms of the mathematical insights. Like there's just a lot of like beautiful connections with two-stage least squares, especially in like other things that I just totally missed the first time I read it, because I was just trying to see like, well, what is this idea that IV can be causal? And so I was focusing more on like the applied stuff, I think, like Angers-Kruger 91 and stuff like that.
So your time at MIT, what's the, everybody changes a lot over their training. What do you think? What do you think that time was for you?
I changed a ton. So before going to MIT, I worked at the New York Fed for 2 years, and I actually worked in the finance group. And so when I came to MIT, the thing that I knew the most about was corporate finance. And so I was pretty sure I would go and like do corporate finance. But then the nice thing about MIT is that in your first year, when most grad programs focus on taking micro, macro, and metrics, they also encourage you to take a field class. And so I ended up kind of by chance, honestly, taking labor, not because I knew anything about labor, but because someone suggested it as a good sort of first class to take. And Josh taught that class along with Parag Pathak, both of whom became my advisors later. Part of that class, we had to do a replication exercise, and I really enjoyed that. And basically through that class, started talking to Josh, and eventually got involved in the work at Blueprint Labs at MIT, which is Josh's sort of education lab. Started doing this stuff on charter schools, and kind of similarly,
that's where that started.
So kind of similarly to when I first learned about stats, like I didn't know anything about education research, or I knew some things about IV, but not really Josh's world of IV. But it just grabbed me in the same way, and never looked back. And so that was in the first year. Basically, I went from not really knowing what I wanted to do research on to just having this very clear sense that if I could hack it, I wanted to do something related to applied econometrics and labor. It was not obvious to me at all when I first started that I could do econometrics, because it has this like aura of being very difficult and very mathematical. And I was not, a Putnam scholar. Like I was not, the type of, I didn't know measure theory at first, And so it was not obvious to me that I could do this work, but it became more obvious as I went along that there was this sort of path for more applied metrics research.
Like moving into this paper, I wanted to talk about
Yeah.
IV, and I wanted to talk about your new paper with Paul Goldsmith-Pinkham and I say Michael Kolesar, but that's not right, is it?
It's funny. I say Michal sometimes,
Oh,
but sometimes I say Michael too. My sense is he doesn't mind which way you say
okay,
it.
good. All
Yeah.
right. I want to talk about both of them. They're probably going to just naturally lead into each other. But this new paper on estimating multiple treatment effects with regression.
Yeah.
Before we get into the details of it, I interviewed Imbens a couple of weeks ago, and I asked him, like when him and Angers had that late result that for the late theorem paper, how much of it was just like that potential outcomes opened up the problem for them. And he said, it really did a lot. They had a late result with the latent index model, but he said like it really kind of opened up a lot. And so I was kind of, in looking at this paper, I was just kind of like remembering back to when I first took econometrics. One of the things that really struck me was, oh, well, you can like control for stuff. You can like run this regression and then you can like control for stuff. And you can have all these covariates and how many things in econometrics that we sort of know, we actually don't have that potential outcomes taught to us at the beginning. And I was looking through this paper and it's like this weird feeling reading the paper, because I feel like you're telling me that that controlling for stuff is kind of true and not true at the same time.
Yeah.
And there's all this potential outcomes modeling in it. So before we like get into it, I'm just kind of curious, is potential outcomes modeling opening up regression and we don't really understand it like we think we do, or is that overstating it, or what?
No, I think that's a fair characterization. I think one way to view what potential outcomes is it's a model that allows you to consider, arbitrary misspecification in a particular sense, right? It's like a model of how variables relate to each other that is non-parametric, right? It doesn't assume linearity at its basic form. And so what you can do is take that model and see what the estimand of a regression gives you when you relax those sort of assumptions. I mean, that's really the core of the late result. It's a core of a lot of the stuff we've been seeing recently with the diff and diff literature, is people taking the potential outcomes model and just seeing, well, okay, we have this model, we have this procedure which turns data into estimates, right? Diff and diff or regression or IV. And let's just see what this machine does when we apply it to this more general model. And I think in the process, we've learned a lot. So, the paper you're talking about relates to this earlier paper by Josh, actually in 1998, an econometric paper studying the effects of volunteer service in the military on later life outcomes, earning outcomes related to his draft lottery stuff earlier. And there's a very sort of now, I think, famous result there that says, well, if I regress on a binary treatment and flexible controls, so think of that as like just binary indicators for which group you're in and as controls, that's the most flexible you can get sort of, then, applying the potential outcomes framework to that procedure, what that procedure identifies is a convex average of treatment effects when the treatment is conditionally and randomly assigned. So that's this famous result, Angers 1998. And, that's in mostly Harmless. Josh teaches that. It's a very nice result because it draws this connection between other methods of estimating treatment effects like propensity score weighting or matching, and regression, which you can think of as basically giving you some weighted average of convex effects.
Yeah.
What I think, we've learned since then is that result is actually kind of special and does not generalize well outside of the single treatment case. It does generalize outside the binary treatment case. So it works, it turns out, if you have a continuous treatment or multi-value treatment. But it turns out, and this is the point of our new paper, is that, if, as is often the case, you're trying to estimate the effects of multiple treatments jointly, you don't get this Angers 98 result. So regression is kind of special in how it treats sort of single treatments. And
Mhm.
I think, so a couple of things about that. First of all, we've actually known for a little while now that that's also true for IV. So for IV, there's the late theorem for binary treatments. There's generalizations of that for continuous treatments and multi-value treatments. But it turns out that IV with two treatments, mutually exclusive treatments, does not have a kind of natural late interpretation, except under pretty strong conditions on either treatment effect heterogeneity or compliance patterns. And so it turns out that that's also true for regression. And so there's something, the way I think of it is like, if you're doing a bivariate regression, or you're doing Frisch-Wahl and a bivariate regression, so you're basically interested in just one treatment coefficient, then you can write the regression or the IV as kind of a ratio. And ratios are sort of intuitive and they work nicely. Once you add multiple treatments, then we have to deal with matrix inverses. And it turns out that matrix inverses are just like more complicated than we think. Right. I joked about this a little while ago. It's just a more complicated computation that doesn't play well with the potential outcomes model as we think. Anyways, so this is a very long-winded answer to your question of, yeah, I think that's exactly the value of the potential outcomes model, is it allows us to make these kind of judgments about procedures which we think we know and we think we trust in a more general setting. The more recent version of our paper, which we hope to put out soon, maybe by the time this is posted, we'll see, it actually draws connections between the result in that literature and the diff and diff literature. So it turns out it's actually all kind of one phenomenon of contamination bias, the same as what Sun and Abraham are pointing out in their paper. Deshays-Martin-Foy, the same thing there, the same as in Bouriersac et al. It turns out that all these things can be nested in a general result. But I think the virtue of our newer paper is to focus on a setting which has not been considered often, which is kind of a more design-based approach where you're not using parallel trends or diff and diff, but you're really using the conditional random assignment of a treatment.
Well, that's interesting because, just for the people that are listening, this I have another interview with Sophie Sun, but like in that paper, the contamination is on this. It would seem as though it's really specific because it's like it's an event study, diff and diff. For those listening, it's an event study. All the leads and lags of interacting the treatments with these relative time indicators, differential timing, OLS model. And the problem is coming from already treated groups. It's all this typical new diff and diff stuff. But the result is really interesting because it's like every lead and lag is being contaminated by other treatment effects from other leads and lags. But you're saying that all of these covariate regression, all of these models with multiple treatments, not even, they're all having features like that. So that must mean like they all have these weights that are deleting things. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, so the Sun and Abraham results, one way to think of it is that, you have these indicators for relative time till treatment. You could think of those as different treatments. So, there's a natural panel set up here, but there doesn't have to be. You could just think of it as like a cross section with certain controls, some of which are fixed effects. And so mechanically, that's the connection to our paper. But yeah, so basically what we do in the new version of the paper, which hopefully again will be out soon, is we consider sort of two identification strategies. One, which is model-based, where you model the sort of trends in the outcome basically and restrict those trends to be the same across different treatment groups. That's kind of the diff and diff approach.
Got it.
One is design-based, where you don't make any assumptions about potential outcomes, but you model the assignment of the treatment. You say it's like conditionally random given some stuff. And what we show is that under either of those two approaches, you get this contamination phenomenon. And what that means is that the effect, the coefficient on any given treatment, whether that's truly like I randomly assign people to one of three treatments at a given point in time, or like in Sun and Abraham, I look at pre and post periods, the coefficient on each of those treatments includes both the own treatment effect and a linear combination of effects on other treatments. Again, this is in a regression which regresses some outcome on a bunch of treatment indicators and flexible controls. And the weights in the contamination terms, some of which are positive, some of which are negative, basically mean that in general, you can have kind of weird stuff coming out of the regression. It's not one thing I want to be clear on here is that, it's not a theorem that there is a problem. It's a potential for a problem. And the way that problem manifests is if you have heterogeneous effects and you have that effect heterogeneity being correlated with the weights that regression puts on the different groups.
Yeah.
If that heterogeneity is minimal or it's uncorrelated with the weights, then there is no problem, actually. Things sort of wash out. But it's the potential for a problem. And again, it occurs either in the design-based setup or in the model-based setup. The one difference, just to point this out, there's also this concern about, even if you only have one treatment in the diff and diff setup, this is kind of like in the Goodman-Bacon paper or in the Deschaise-Martin-Daufoy paper, even if you only have one treatment, you still get sort of negative weights potentially on own treatment effects. That turns out to be specific to model-based identification strategies like diff and diff. So the own treatment negative weighting, the negative weights put on the own treatment effect, not Sun and Abraham, that's specific to diff and diff. And again, this goes back to the Angress 98 paper, which says that if you have conditional random assignment, if you have that model, that design-based approach, then you don't have negative weights. So the model-based setup, I might have said things wrong before. The model-based setup is the one with negative weights in the own treatment.
Well, so in that Sophie Sun and Sarah Abraham paper, yeah, it's kind of funny. Y'all were colleagues, right? Y'all were classmates.
Yeah.
This kind of in the air. Y'all were thinking about a lot of these things.
It's really funny. So they were a bit behind me in grad school time. But I spent a year after grad school at Microsoft Research, which is just next door to MIT. And I was actually working on a paper about mover regressions, which is still just a working paper on my website, but it was sort of, I think before this literature, I mean, other people were thinking about this at the same time, but before the other papers had come out, I was thinking about mover regressions. Turns out that Sun and Abraham, they were, Sophie was also thinking about, and Sarah were often also thinking about this stuff. And so we actually had like a couple of lunches where we were working on it, and they were like, okay, we're going to think about the like over time, problems, and you can think about the like mover problems. Turns out they're the same thing, as we now learned in this new paper. But yeah, there was definitely something in the air. I mean, I think it's hard when you go through a class at MIT and you see potential outcomes and you see these kinds of results like you were talking about, where you see what potential outcomes buys you in a given regression procedure, IV procedure. It's hard to not think about that everywhere and start thinking about it in panel data and stuff like that.
Yeah. It makes me, it's like I keep thinking, if we're still learning what OLS is, it's like it makes me wonder how much was this like low hanging? It's like it makes me wonder, was this low hanging fruit, like this paper that you're working on getting it out? But it's not really. It's deep. It's real deep things. But why is it just now? Why is it just now that this is?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, some would say that they've sort of known problems like this exist for a long time. And I think, actually, before all this stuff was happening, I was, in grad school doing some stuff with like diff and diff. And I'm sure many other people had this experience as well, where you run a diff and diff, you get some estimate, and they're like, okay, I'm going to like look at subgroups or something. And then you get subgroups and they're like very weird in relation to the overall diff and diff. And so I think there's been some applied intuition out there for a long time that like something is weird with these sorts of regressions.
Right.
And that's actually something that I think is really great about this recent trend in econ and in metrics, is that it is really intertwined with the applied work. Like it's very attentive to the things that applied researchers want to know about and want solutions for. And, if you look at the people writing these papers, like some of them are like more pure econometricians, but most of them are not. So most of them are people that also work on, substantive research questions, not methodological research questions. And So to answer your question, I think it was low-hanging fruit in one sense, but it took that, I think, that shift towards, really attending to sort of applied questions, which is not a new trend, but I think it's been a trend that's been growing for a long time now. And I think that's partly the reason why we see what we see now.
Yeah. In this result, in your estimating multiple treatment effects with regression, it's like, it's like you think about all this diff and diff stuff, and so much of it's about heterogeneity.
Yeah.
And since there's multiple treatments, there's heterogeneity. So, but it's like, I always kind of thought that the diff and diff work was all about heterogeneity. And so I guess I'm just trying to figure out, like, should I be drawing some crosswalk here with that? By having multiple treatments, it's heterogeneous.
Yeah, so it's both in our paper. So there's definitely, different effects across different treatments, but the bias problem that we're studying is very similar in that it's heterogeneity across units, across people for a given treatment. So the ingredients for there to be a problem is that, any given treatment effect is very variable across people. And again, that variation is sort of systematically correlated with something in the regression, which doesn't have a super intuitive meaning all the time. But and just to belabor this point, because I think it's kind of important and sometimes lost in this discussion. It's not a guarantee that there's a problem. And in fact, I in my own, on this topic of, applied work, on my own, like, replications and sort of futzing with this stuff, my sense is that in a lot of settings, the correlation between treatment effect heterogeneity and weights is not super strong, such that maybe there isn't that big of a problem in a lot of these cases. But that's just my
does that make you think that heterogeneity is not as, it's like, it's funny to think about, the late result. And I would think about the late result is like, it's like extreme heterogeneity, signs can flip at the local and all these kinds of things. But then I've also kind of looked around and some of these diff and diffs with differential timing, like, I get the same thing. Using not always. You can jimmy it, obviously, where it gets crazy, but
I think it's pretty unrealistic to say that there's no treatment effect heterogeneity. I think it's much more reasonable to think that in a lot of settings, people are not selecting on heterogeneity in a way that screws up, say, regression or adds complexity to IV. So I think, this is related to our own work, thinking about like school quality and hospital quality. It looks like, people select on not on those treatment effects, but on like sort of the levels, like the potential outcomes. And you'd think in our models, like, going back to Roy and other models like that, you think that there should be selection on gains. And I think that in some settings there definitely is, but in a lot of settings, I mean, we know causal inference is hard. Like, it's hard enough to get an average treatment effect. And we have PhDs. It's harder to imagine that in a given setting, people are sort of accurately predicting the heterogeneity in their own effects and selecting on it. And so that's how I sort of think about it now. I think, like, in a lot of settings, it's important to check whether treatment effect heterogeneity is important and screws up your regression estimates. But if you find that it doesn't, maybe you shouldn't be so surprised depending on the setting, because it does really take a certain level of sophistication to think that that's goes up.
That's interesting. So kind of like, making a transition, it's kind of funny that when I think about this Paul, Goldsmith-Pinkham, you and Michael, it's like, I think kind of the Judge IV people a little bit. You and
it's funny, this paper actually started because we were trying to write a Judge IV paper. We still are writing a Judge IV paper. That's also in the works. But we started, Paul and I have been talking for a really long time about trying to bring out more of the econometrics of that work, because it's exploding. People are doing Judge IV everywhere. And we think that there's some subtle issues there that aren't always, discussed. And so we started working on that. And then we brought in Michal because he's been thinking about the econometrics here for a really long time. And then it was around this time last year that we were working on it. And at some point we realized that there was like an issue, which is that in the Judge IV setting, it's kind of a multiple treatment setting where in IV land, where the treatments are like indicators for being assigned to different judges and you have controls. And we realized that there was this contamination bias problem in the first stage, which can lead to sort of problems in the Judge IV setup. But when we realized it, we were like, oh, this is actually a much more general problem. And that's why the multiple
Why did y'all
treatments
see
paper
that
got
anyway? Well, you're thinking about judge instruments all the time, but why did that make you think there was some contamination? Because like it
right.
seems like with the judge design, and this is probably going to expose my, me being ignorant, but like I always just kind of think of, well, I'm just using them as instruments, and so I don't really care about the coefficients on them.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of trying to induce variation from
Yeah.
them. So
think
what is
about
going on?
Yeah. So think about the first stage regression in a judge IV. So it's like my treatment on judge fixed effects and controls. Now, for the listeners who aren't like Scott and I have talked about this a lot, so this is like maybe not obvious to people listening. Often in judge IV, you actually use like a leniency measure as your instrument, but it turns out that there's some equivalencies there, such that when you're using leniency, I think you should really think about what you're doing as using the assignment to different judges. So think about a first stage sort of in that spirit where I regress treatment on judge indicators and controls. So that's a multiple treatment regression, right, of different judge indicators.
Yeah.
And
the first stage is causal under independence.
First stage is causal, absolutely.
It's actually the exact situation.
Right. But remember that for IV to work well, or to be guaranteed to work well, we need monotonicity, right? So we need the coefficient on each judge indicator to be causal in that sense. With contamination bias, the coefficient on each judge indicator is actually a weighted average of own judge effects and effects across different judges. So even if you have monotonicity holding truly for the judges, when you do regression, because of this contamination bias problem, you can have monotonicity violations creep in.
How are you not going to have monotonicity? It seems like you're almost certainly going to have it, aren't you?
Almost certainly. Yeah. I mean, it's the same sort of thing where like you need the violations to be correlated with treatment effect heterogeneity.
Oh, sure.
But yeah, definitely there's a problem potentially.
Like, and so are the standard tests. So none of these like subsample first stage monotonicity.
Yeah, everything is
get in it, right?
Everything is sort of subject to this potential issue, because often in these regressions, it's important to control for like court by time fixed effects.
Right.
And I think often the paper is presented sort of, again, what we were describing before of like, okay, well, I have some stuff, I just control for it linearly. We know that sort of works. Now I think we have to maybe take into account the fact that doesn't always work. The way that we think.
This must have been really exciting work for you, being a big fan.
It's fun. Yeah,
I bet you have really liked it.
I have. I mean, it's such a joy doing this work, because you work on a problem, you figure out this like issue, and then you just sort of think about all of its implications. And because everyone is sort of talking about metrics now, I mean, like Twitter has really helped in this. Like there's just demand and interest in what I used to think was just like little nerdy things that I would like, sort of share among some co-authors and colleagues. Like now there's, I think, real appetite for applied econometrics in a way that I hadn't seen when I was just coming out of grad school. I think things have really changed in the last couple of years. And working with, people like Paul and Michal and others, all my other co-authors, Kirill, Will Doby, David Arnold, all these people are like, just like, and Jason Ablock, they're just like incredibly thoughtful, and also, kind of drawn from this distribution of like more methodsy people and more applied people. And so it's really fun to just, work on these things with those people. Also, they're all really nice.
Yeah.
Which is also just great.
That's great. That's great. I was talking to Embens. He's kind of got this, he's shared a lot that like when he was a little kid, he got into econometrics because he liked chess. And so it seems like, it's like, I don't, you think like nobody really knows what economists do. It's like this thing that people talk about, like why it's so hard to get people to major in it, because they literally don't have a clue what it is. Everybody knows what a physicist is, and and they've never taken physics and they know what a physicist is. Like they have no clue. Weirdly, they have no clue what an economist is. But it's like, it seems like it's even more true for econometrics. And I was kind of thinking to myself, what do you think? There's some kid out there in Maine, walking around like, looking at the tide pools and stuff, and they have not taken econometrics. Like, what exactly is it that they need to know to make them think this actually, it might look really hard and it is really hard or whatever, but it's like actually taps into something that you already have.
Yeah. Well,
right?
I think there are some concepts around causal inference, not necessarily econometrics, but like, some simple concepts about selection bias, about IV, about, those sorts of issues, which could be and probably should be taught at a very young level,
right?
Without necessarily any reference to economics per se. I mean, it's great to have this methods grounded in a particular subject matter, and we benefit a lot from having the models of econ to sort of guide us. But I think, if I could like convince a group of high schoolers to care about, causal inference and whether DAGs or potential outcomes, like some tool to make progress on using observational data to make inferences about causal or structural parameters, I think you can do that at a pretty high level. And I think you can get people hooked. I mean, I think that when I teach econometrics,
you think DAGs would be really helpful for that?
DAGs are very helpful for that. Yeah. Like I say, I mean, especially for IV and things, it's a very useful way of illustrating, the basic logic of what we're doing. Yeah. And so, and I mean, I think when I teach econometrics, I definitely start from there. I'm like, look, in some level, what we're trying to get at here is a very age-old question. Like causality is this very age-old thing. And, it's inherently a part of the human process to like try and make causal inferences without necessarily being able to randomize stuff.
Right.
And at one level, what econometrics does, what causal inference methods do more generally, is just give you a toolkit for making headway on that sort of fundamental human objective. And I feel like if someone told me that in high school, I would have been hooked right away.
It's gotta be right, because like, even in Mississippi, like where I grew up, I mean, we had the state science fair and you'd go with an experiment.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
It's like, I mean, like the idea of the experiment, something.
I want people to show up to science fair with different diffs, or maybe not different diffs, but something like observational data analysis is something that anyone can do. And in fact, we do all the time informally.
Right.
But if someone, is able to, I think you can do like sort of simple research projects at a very early age. And I think, the more sophisticated stuff requires special data, requires unique institutional circumstances and harder math and stuff like that. But the basic logic of, selection on observables, parallel trends, that sort of thing, like that should be very accessible, I think.
Seems like too, what that kid probably would also like is the real world application. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what you said kind of captivated you, was like to see because you're like sorting into political science, you're kind of like already moving into real world stuff, not just pure math. So probably things like working with data, learning about policies.
I mean, I think we can't lose sight of the actual questions we want to answer. It's like, it's very easy to get stuck in all of the like cool math and stuff, but at the end of the day, the reason we're doing this is to try and improve policy and improve lives. But there's just so many directions you can go. That's one thing about my own work, is that I can't stay constrained to any given field. I find that I'm like moving from like health to education to everything else, because it's like, there's just too many interesting questions on the applied side of things. And once you have a toolkit, you can find the similarities across different contexts and sort of bring it to different questions in a very nice way.
Well, you made this like this cool Bardic instrument paper. And it's kind of funny. It's like a couple of things. Now that you're co-authors with Paul, I feel comfortable asking this question. But for people that are listening, because this all worked out really nice. Like it's like these two really important papers, kind of complementary. But like, was it at all? So the setup for people listening, there's that Peter has with Kirill Borsak and Xavier Yarvel, this paper in Review of Economic Studies on on a particular application of instrumental variables, sometimes called the Bardic instrument and sometimes called shift share. And then Paul Goldsmith-Pinkham with two other people have a paper almost published at the exact same time in the American Economic Review, also on Bardic instruments. And so, but they're very different. Well, they are different. They're not very different, but they're like, they kind of both sort of opened up what this was doing. And so before I kind of get into the background of it, it's just like, was it stressful?
Yes.
You guys were like early in your careers, like one of you gets a publication almost means the other one won't get.
Yeah, we were very lucky in how the dust settled on that. It's funny, Paul and I actually crossed paths at the New York Fed before either of us. Well, he was already in grad school, but before I went into grad school. So I knew Paul for a really long time, actually. And I have this very distinct memory of him presenting an early version of his paper at labor lunch at MIT one day. And I remember sitting there and being like, oh, wow, this is very cool. But like, not being fully, I guess, Paul, if you're listening, apologies, being fully satisfied with how they were thinking about shift share IV. And then it wasn't until later that Kirill and Xavier, they had already started thinking about this stuff, and they sort of asked me to join their project, sort of after grad school. It was stressful. And that's something that's kind of funny about this recent applied econometric surge, is that it's a lot of young people, early career people working on it.
Really matters.
It's kind of it shows that it matters. It shows that people care about it. It's kind of risky, right?
That's what I mean. It matters, who gets what, when, and the fact that this is all like simultaneous events.
No, it's pretty wild when you think about it. And I think by and large it has sort of worked out well, which partly I attribute to the fact that, the people working on this, again, are kind of nice, thoughtful people, and constructive people, right? And maybe it's because we're all young that we don't have sort of weird power dynamics where like, I'm the editor of some top 5, so I can shut out not that this happens, I don't know, but like, what I mean? Like that sort of power dynamic isn't there. I think But it was very stressful. And, as we were writing it, there was a third paper that started coming out, the Adow et al. Paper, which was sort of taking our, identification approach and taking really seriously the inference issues that come out of that. And so, there was a time when there were 3 papers and none of them were submitted yet. And it was very stressful. And somehow we all managed to get, top 5 publications out of it. I don't quite understand how, but I'm very thankful for it. And we're definitely all refereeing each other's papers, and I think making them better, I hope, in the process, and learning a lot in the process for sure.
I wonder if the fact that both of y'all's paper came out at the same time actually endogenously changes y'all's papers, because don't y'all have to kind of like process of like saying what we are and what we're not, and it kind of becomes this like exogenous shift, exogenous share.
Yeah, I think it actually made the paper stronger because it forced us to really differentiate the 2 approaches. So the beauty of shift share IV is that there is actually 2 very fundamental different approaches to identification. One that's based on sort of randomness in the shocks. That's kind of a natural experiment approach. That's like our paper. And one that's based on kind of parallel trends holding with respect to the shares. That's sort of Paul's paper, Paul, Isaac and Henry's paper. And it's kind of cool how both of them could work in principle, but they have very different practical implications. And I think you're right that because we were working on them at the same time, we really had to very clearly define the differences, and especially the practical differences, right? Because someone reading the paper wants to know, like, if I adopt this strategy versus that, how does it affect how I do things?
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that's made them a lot stronger. It's also, in terms of the aftermath, now that they're both published, I've been, this is maybe a plug for doing the Mixtape workshop on shift share IV in a month or so. It's helped with teaching to be able to have these 2 very sort of clear and different approaches to this relatively old instrument that we can contrast and think about together.
Right. So you're going to be doing two workshops on instrumental variables for the Mixtape session stuff. Can you tell me what should people expect? Who is this for, and what should they expect from it?
Yeah, so the one that's coming up is coming up. I don't know when this will be posted, but it's coming up next week. So that'll be like the 27th, I think, and the 28th. So that's going to be a general sort of IV workshop. I did a very similar one back in March that seemed to go over pretty well, and so we're going to sort of do a take two, spread over 2 days with a bit of restructuring in the material. Yeah. I think that one's sort of targeted at people who, maybe you learned about IV at some point, but you feel like you didn't get a super rigorous, explanation of it. Or, maybe you're a grad student and you're learning about these things right now and you sort of want a different perspective on it. We go through the basics of IV and then we do some frontier stuff. So like, thinking about characterizing compliers in a heterogeneous treatment effect approach, or thinking about judge IV, we talk a lot about, and I'm going to talk a little bit about shift share IV in that, but it's mostly going to be sort of the basics of IV. And then the second one is this new shift share IV specific one. I'm very excited about that one. I've been sort of doing guest lectures here and there on shift share IV. And so I have this accumulated set of lecture notes, but I haven't sort of sat down and really fleshed them out. And, one of the things we try and do in the workshops is have these like labs where you actually code for yourself and see how I code for myself, like these different procedures. And so developing labs for shift share IV, that one's going to be a lot of fun. It's also going to relate to this newer work that Kirill Borisiak and I have been doing on instrument recentering, which is sort of a generalization of some of the stuff in shift share IV. But so I'm very excited about both of these. The Mixtape thing is awesome because it just allows you to reach this audience that you otherwise wouldn't. And, it's very interactive. It's very fun to teach. And so hopefully there'll be more courses coming. We can develop some more sort of remixes and whatever musical puns we can come up with. Right?
Solos and duets and stuff.
Yeah, duets.
Well, it's so much fun to talk. And I good luck with this paper. It's probably good. Is this the kind of paper with Paul and Michael that you feel like people, when they read it, are going to be like nervous that the papers on their Vita are need to have an asterisk?
I think people will be pleasantly surprised by the way that we spin the paper, because I think again, getting back to this point, it's important to point out when potential problems exist, but the fact that a potential problem exists does not mean that a problem exists. I think we're gonna, try and spin it neutrally and say like, look, you should maybe check that there are these problems, but keep calm, like don't panic, as they say in Mostly Harmless, right? And like Hitchhikers, right? So that's my hope, is that it's nothing to be too afraid of. The truth will set you free.
That's exactly right. Right. All right, man. It's good to see you.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Thanks for the opportunity.
All right.